the British unit that operated in plain clothes, while Parliament was told no SAS were deployed. Opening hook. There is a peculiar art to telling the truth while saying nothing at all. For decades, the British government perfected this practice with the Special Air Service, a unit so compartmentalized, so carefully managed through parliamentary statement, that the official position and the operational reality existed in two different dimensions. Members of Parliament would ask direct questions about SAS deployments. Ministers would answer truthfully in a technical sense, while the regiment operated unacknowledged in theaters across the world. This is not speculation or conspiracy theory. This is documented history, uncovered through medals records, veterans' accounts, court inquiries, and the careful language of parliamentary Hansard. This is the story of how one of the world's most elite fighting forces operated under a veil of official denial, and how that veil, eventually, always frays. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button to not miss any story. And check out our Patreon in the description. We post full uncensored stories there. Every graphic detail, every brutal moment, nothing redacted. Stories YouTube won't allow. Now let's get into it. The mechanism of denial begins with language. Parliamentary questions are answered with what observers describe as linguistic precision, technically accurate statements that leave out the most important context. A minister might truthfully state that no regular SAS squadron is deployed, while omitting that training teams, liaison officers, or operational advisors are in theater. The distinction is real in military terminology, but meaningless to the public, seeking to understand whether British Special Forces are engaged in active operations. This exploitation of language precision became, over time, a systematic framework that allowed the government to maintain what might be called a shadow narrative alongside the official narrative. Members of Parliament asked increasingly specific questions, as rumors and intelligence leaks suggested SAS involvement in operations that ministers denied. But the language of those denials had been carefully chosen. A question about whether the SAS was operating would be answered with a statement about the SAS's overall role in national defense. A question about deployment in a specific region would be answered with information about recruitment and training levels. The government spokesperson would maintain with technical accuracy that nothing had been said that was false. And yet every interview, every parliamentary answer, every formal statement had been constructed to obscure rather than illuminate. According to declassified parliamentary records and veteran accounts, this became the standard practice during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, a conflict that spanned 3 decades and saw the SAS operate continuously in the province despite official statements suggesting otherwise. The regiment operated in plain clothes, in unmarked vehicles, without obvious insignia or clear command authority. They were soldiers and secret operatives simultaneously, a contradiction that only worked because the operational theatre, a United Kingdom territory, created legal ambiguity that Westminster exploited fully. The Troubles presented a unique problem for British governance. This was not a foreign war where operational security could be maintained through distance and international opacity. This was internal to the United Kingdom, within the Crown's own borders, yet it required the kind of covert military operations that governments typically reserved for overseas conflicts. Members of Parliament represented constituencies in Northern Ireland. Constituents lived under what amounted to an undeclared military occupation by special forces that the government was telling Parliament did not exist. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary, yet it persisted for decades because Parliament itself was complicit in the silence. Members knew, or suspected, the truth, but the mechanisms of parliamentary procedure and the compartmentalization of classified information meant that the knowledge could not be officially acknowledged or debated. The result was a system where elected representatives were systematically kept outside information about military operations being conducted within their own constituencies. What does a plainclothes SAS operation actually look like operationally? Sources describe a deliberately ambiguous profile. An SAS patrol team might appear as construction workers in high-visibility jackets, their weapons secured in ordinary-looking bags. A 4-man team conducting surveillance on an IRA active service unit would operate from a civilian safe house, indistinguishable from the neighborhood around it. According to accounts from those who served, the operational advantage of this posture was not only concealment from the target, but also strategic deniability. If something went wrong, If an operation crossed legal lines, the government could maintain that regular soldiers were not involved. The practical challenge for operators was constant. A uniformed soldier walking through a street in Belfast was clearly military and was immediately identifiable to anyone who was watching. A plainclothes operative blended in, but at extraordinary personal cost. If captured, that operative might not be treated as a prisoner of war. If there was controversy over an operation, that operative could not claim the protections that uniform would have provided. The IRA and other Republican groups had shot informants and suspected intelligence operatives throughout the conflict. An SAS operative in plain clothes, if identified as an operative, was at risk of assassination or summary execution. The operators accepted this risk. They understood that they were operating in a gray zone, legally and morally. They understood that if something went wrong, if they killed someone who later turned out to be innocent, if they were captured, the government's position would be that they were not acting under military orders. This created an extraordinary burden of personal responsibility that soldiers normally do not carry. A uniformed soldier can make mistakes within the context of military operations and have the institutions stand behind them. A plainclothes operative had to know that if the institution found it politically convenient to deny them, it would do so without hesitation. The distinction matters operationally because of rules of engagement. Uniformed soldiers have certain legal protections and restrictions. Plainclothes operatives exist in a gray zone. They are British soldiers, answerable to British military law, but they operate like intelligence agents. They can position themselves in environments where uniformed soldiers would be immediately identifiable. They can conduct surveillance for longer periods. They can engage in what might appear to be civilian activity while gathering military intelligence. This ambiguity, according to military historians and legal scholars who have examined the matter, was part of the design. Between 1976 and the early 1990s, the SAS conducted sustained operations in Northern Ireland that were documented only in fragmentary ways, through medals records, through accounts given at inquests into controversial operations, and through the testimony of retired officers. According to a report by the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee examining classified operations, the regiment's presence in the province was continuous, but official parliamentary statements consistently used language that allowed denial. When asked directly whether SAS units were deployed, ministers would say that deployment levels were consistent with recruitment and training needs. Technically true, but useless as information. This period saw multiple changes in government, from Labour to Conservative and back, yet the fundamental policy of denial remained constant regardless of which party held power. This suggests that the denial was not a partisan political maneuver but rather an institutional commitment at the highest levels of the state. Prime ministers and foreign secretaries were personally aware of SAS operations and actively maintained the denials. According to accounts from civil servants who worked during the period, there were explicit conversations at cabinet level about how to handle parliamentary questions. The government did not stumble into a position of denial. It deliberately constructed and maintained that position year after year, decade after decade, through multiple administrations. This sustained commitment to denial, across political boundaries and across time, suggests a fundamental belief within the British state that certain operations required this level of concealment, that the public interest was served by maintaining it, and that democratic accountability had to be subordinated to operational security. The operational security rationale was real and substantive. IRA commanders studied British military patterns with the sophistication of any insurgent command that understands asymmetric warfare. Confirming SAS deployment would have been a tactical gift to the enemy, providing intelligence that would force tactical adjustments across the entire network. According to military doctrine documents and strategic assessments from that period, special forces' effectiveness depends partly on adversary uncertainty about when and where they will appear. Once an enemy knows special forces are present and active, they can adjust tactics, increase security measures, and take countermeasures. They can position lookouts. They can develop counter-surveillance procedures. They can move operations to locations they know are safer. They can increase armed presence in areas where SAS activity might occur. This operational logic has substance and was not merely theoretical. The IRA's tactical responses to known British military presence in various regions of Northern Ireland demonstrated that they adjusted operations based on intelligence about what forces were opposing them. The more the IRA knew about British capabilities and presence, the more effectively they could work around those capabilities. This created a genuine operational imperative for not confirming SAS deployment. But there was also a political dimension to the denial that went beyond operational security and into the realm of narrative control. The SAS carried a symbolic weight in British military culture that no ordinary regiment possessed. They were the nation's most elite unit, with a reputation for decisive action and unconventional methods. Confirming their deployment in an ongoing conflict signaled that the situation was serious, that conventional forces were insufficient, that the government viewed the threat as requiring the nation's best. This messaging had implications for how the conflict was perceived internationally and domestically. If the government confirmed that the SAS was operating in Northern Ireland, it would be admitting that the Troubles constituted a threat of the highest order. It would be admitting that the situation had spiraled beyond what ordinary police and conventional military forces could manage. It would be signaling to the IRA and to the broader Republican movement that Britain considered them a serious enough enemy to deploy its most elite forces. This would, perversely, elevate the IRA's status. It would validate their narrative that they were fighting a genuine military opponent, not merely criminal elements that the police could control. Politically, within the British state, confirming SAS deployment would validate critics who said the government had lost control of the situation. It would undercut the narrative that the Troubles were a policing matter rather than a military conflict. The government therefore had strong political incentives to deny SAS deployment, independent of operational security concerns. The denial allowed the government to maintain simultaneously that the situation was serious enough to justify extraordinary measures, while also maintaining that it was not so serious as to require formal military escalation or public acknowledgment of elite forces being engaged. Between 1976 and 1992, sources described the SAS conducting surveillance operations, mounted patrols, and direct action missions against suspected IRA leadership and active service units. The scale of these operations was extraordinary. According to accounts in published histories and veteran interviews, these operations achieved significant tactical results. They disrupted IRA capabilities, gathered intelligence on command structures, and eliminated key operatives. At their height, SAS operations were operating continuously across multiple regions of Northern Ireland, with rotating teams maintaining pressure on the IRA's command structure and operational capacity. These operations were being conducted simultaneously with the government's insistence to Parliament that no such operations were taking place. But the operations also became controversial, particularly after incidents that resulted in civilian casualties or raised questions about whether operators had followed proper rules of engagement. The controversial operations created a tension within the government. On one hand, the SAS operations were clearly effective at disrupting IRA activities. On the other hand, controversial incidents created demands for investigations and accountability. When investigations occurred, they threatened to expose details of operations that the government was denying had occurred in the first place. The shooting at Loughgall in 1987 is a documented case that illustrates the tension between operational effectiveness and legal accountability. An IRA active service unit, having conducted a bombing, was ambushed by what sources describe as an SAS patrol that was pre-positioned based on intelligence. 8 IRA members were killed. The operation was tactically successful. It disrupted a major bombing campaign and removed experienced operators from the IRA's order of battle. The scale of the casualty toll was significant within the context of Northern Ireland's conflict. 8 experienced operators lost represented a substantial degradation of the IRA's capacity to conduct coordinated bombing campaigns. But the operation also raised questions, examined at inquests and in parliamentary debate, about whether the force used was proportionate and whether all available alternatives had been exhausted. Questions emerged about whether the SAS team could have apprehended rather than killed the IRA members. Questions emerged about whether lethal force was justified. Questions emerged about what rules of engagement the SAS team had been operating under and who had authorized them. These questions threatened to expose the fact that an SAS team had been operating in a pre-positioned ambush, which required advanced intelligence, advanced authorization, and coordination that would only be available if the government had indeed deployed the SAS, despite denying it to Parliament. Officially, the operation was attributed to security forces without specifying unit. According to accounts from those involved, it was an SAS operation. The unit had been positioned in the area based on intelligence suggesting the IRA unit would attempt the bombing. When the operation occurred, the SAS reacted decisively, but the pre-positioning raised legal questions. Had the unit been authorized to engage as they did? Had they been acting on civilian police authority or military command? The ambiguity was not accidental. It allowed the government to maintain the operational security benefits of not confirming SAS involvement while leaving open the possibility of denying responsibility if political consequences became severe. This pattern repeated across different regions and theaters, becoming a standard practice for how the British government managed special operations. In the Balkans during the 1990s, when the international community deployed forces to address ethnic cleansing and the collapse of Yugoslavia, the SAS was present from the earliest phase. According to parliamentary records and military histories, British special forces were involved in reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and direct action operations in Bosnia and Kosovo. The operations were significant and risky. They involved insertion into hostile territory, collection of intelligence on war criminals and military targets, and in some cases direct engagement with forces that were actively committing atrocities. But official statements regarding SAS deployment were carefully worded to acknowledge only training roles or liaison functions. When asked about British Special Forces involvement in the Balkans, government spokespersons would discuss training provided to local forces or liaison activities with NATO partners. The regiment was there, conducting operations, but officially they were doing something else. This created the same pattern of denial that had characterized Northern Ireland. Operators understood the operational necessity for the denial in the Balkans context as well. The Bosnian Serb forces they were opposing had access to their own intelligence and would have adjusted tactics if they knew elite British special forces were operating against them. The operational advantage of this stance was similar to Northern Ireland. The SAS could operate with less political constraint if no one was officially acknowledging they were operating. Local adversaries wouldn't know they were being hunted by Britain's best special forces. They would know only that patrols in the area had become more lethal or that their camps had been destroyed. According to military analysts, this uncertainty itself was a form of advantage, but it also created a problem of democratic accountability. In a functioning democracy, the public is supposed to know broadly what their military is doing. Parliament is supposed to exercise oversight. Citizens are supposed to understand the commitments their nation is making. The SAS's structure and the classification regime around Special Forces operations meant that this accountability was severely constrained. Parliaments could ask questions, but the answers, while technically true, revealed nothing meaningful. The tension came to a head repeatedly. In 1992, a parliamentary inquiry examined SAS operations during a specific period in Northern Ireland. The inquiry found that certain operations had occurred, but that the details remained classified. This became the pattern: confirmation that operations happened, denial of specific details that might. Medals records showed which SAS personnel were awarded for service during particular periods. Court cases and inquests revealed operational details. Historians assembled accounts from retired officers. By the early 2000s, a far clearer picture had emerged than official statements had ever provided. One of the most significant breaches in the official denial came through medal citations. The SAS, like all military units, awards medals for operational service. Those medal citations, when eventually released or discovered by researchers, contained operational details. According to analysis of available citations, they showed that SAS personnel had received decorations for operations in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The citation itself sometimes was the first official confirmation that the unit had been engaged in a theater that the government had never explicitly confirmed. The Iraq deployments of 2003 onwards followed a different pattern. The invasion was announced, Iraq was an official theater of operations, and there was no hiding the fact that special forces were involved. But even here, the mechanisms of denial persisted. According to accounts in published military histories and journalistic investigations, the SAS operated under compartmentalized command structures. They reported up different chains. Some operations were conducted under Joint Special Operations Command Authority rather than conventional British military chain of command. Some operations were conducted in support of intelligence agencies rather than direct military objectives. The public could see that the SAS was in Iraq, but they could not see clearly what the SAS was doing or under whose authority it was operating. Sources describe the operational culture of plainclothes deployments as producing a certain type of soldier, refined through extended service in Northern Ireland. These operators worked with minimal support infrastructure. They were expected to be self-sufficient and to improvise solutions to problems that conventional units would escalate to higher authority. They operated under rules of engagement that were often ambiguous or that left significant discretion to the patrol commander. The ambiguity was not accidental, it was structurally necessary. If rules of engagement were too detailed or too restrictive, they would constrain operators and reduce effectiveness. If they were too vague, operators could claim they didn't understand the limits of their authority. The solution was rules of engagement that were specific enough to constrain the most egregious abuses, but vague enough to allow operators to use judgment. They had to navigate not only the conventional challenge of military operations, but also the legal complexity of operating in a gray zone where military law and civilian law overlapped, and where the government's denial meant they could not claim to be operating under military authority if questioned. This created an extraordinary legal exposure for operators. A uniformed soldier operating under military orders can argue that they were following orders. A plainclothes operative cannot make that argument if the government is denying they were operating under military orders in the first place. According to accounts from retired SAS officers, this created a culture of acceptance around moral ambiguity that permeated the regiment's operations. You were the state's sword in situations where the state could not openly acknowledge the sword was drawn. You operated under rules of engagement that could not be fully explained because the operation itself was denied. You bore responsibility for decisions made in circumstances where the government would not stand behind you publicly if something went wrong. You had to understand that if an operation became controversial, if questions were raised about what you had done and why, the government's first instinct would be to deny knowledge of it rather than defend it. This created an extraordinary burden that went beyond the ordinary risks of military service. This was, according to those who experienced it, an extraordinary burden. One account from a retired officer described it as operating with the knowledge that you were serving a state that would save itself at your expense if the moment demanded it. The operators understood this implicitly. It was not stated in training or in briefings, but it was understood by anyone who had spent time in the system. You were operating in a protected space created by the government, but you were not guaranteed that the government would protect you if that space was breached. The effect on individual operators was significant and long-lasting. According to psychiatric evaluations conducted on special forces personnel and documented in military medical literature, operators in plainclothes environments in urban settings experienced higher stress levels than those operating in clearly defined conflict zones. There were no uniforms that signaled to an enemy that military operations were occurring. There was no clear front line where normal combat psychology applied. There was only a constant awareness that you could be compromised, that you could be identified, that at any moment the ambiguity that protected the nation might become a liability that hung you out to dry. The psychological literature on plainclothes operations identified specific stress markers that distinguished these operators from conventional soldiers. There was persistent hypervigilance that did not diminish after operations concluded. There were elevated rates of anxiety disorders and insomnia that often persisted for years or decades. There was a distinctive form of distrust, not just of enemies but of civilian populations and even of government institutions. Operators understood that they were operating in a gray zone that could be denied, and this understanding created a form of psychological isolation. They could not share their experiences fully with family members who lacked clearances. They could not participate in public discussions about their service. Even within the military, the operations were compartmentalized. The psychological effect of this compartmentalization was similar to that experienced by intelligence operatives who work undercover. The operators themselves, in debriefings and interviews with mental health professionals, described a persistent sense of alienation from normal society and a feeling that their service would be forever undisclosed. Several prominent cases illustrated this explicitly and painfully. In the late 1980s, according to publicly available court records and historical accounts, SAS operators involved in certain operations were, as one account described it, denied by the government when operations went wrong. An operator's family had to wage a legal battle to establish that their relative had been acting under military orders, that the denial was political rather than factual, and that the government had obligations to the men operating in the gray zone it had created. These cases became landmark moments in understanding the limits of official denial. When an SAS operator was killed and the government initially denied involvement, the family was left without official recognition, without military honors, without the pension and support that normally accompanied military service. The government's position was that if the operator had been operating under military authority, then the government would recognize the death and provide appropriate honors. But if the government was denying the operation, then it could not simultaneously acknowledge that the operator had been acting under military authority. The families faced an impossible contradiction. The legal battles that followed established important precedents. Courts examined the chain of command and determined that operations had indeed been authorized at the highest levels. This meant the government had been lying when it denied knowledge of the operations. Once the courts had made these determinations, the government was forced to reverse its denials and provide recognition. But the damage had been done to the families, who had spent years fighting for acknowledgment that their relatives had been serving their country. This tension between operational security and democratic accountability created perverse incentives. An operation that went well could be denied indefinitely because denying it had no political cost. An operation that went badly faced a choice: admit it happened and face political consequences, or maintain the denial and hope that the truth never fully emerged. According to military historians, this incentive structure sometimes led to decisions that prioritized protecting political figures over honoring the operators themselves. The machinery of denial eventually broke down, but slowly. The Freedom of Information Act, enacted in 2000 in the United Kingdom, created mechanisms for the public to request disclosure of classified information. Over subsequent years, researchers, journalists, and relatives of SAS personnel filed requests. Some requests were granted, some were refused, but each small disclosure filled in pieces of the larger picture. According to analysis of disclosure patterns, information that had been classified at the highest levels for decades was eventually released without significant security consequences. The inquests into controversial operations proved particularly revealing. When a civilian was killed in an SAS operation, an inquest had to be held. The inquest could not operate under the same classification regime as Parliament. Evidence had to be presented, questions had to be answered. According to accounts of these inquests, the public learned far more about SAS operational procedures, rules of engagement, and decision-making processes through inquests into controversial killings than through any parliamentary inquiry. By the 2010s, the mechanisms of denial had become less effective and less necessary. The SAS was openly acknowledged as being deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was no denying it. The deployments were publicly confirmed, and the operations were extensively covered by media and documented in official military histories. The nature of the threat and the character of modern warfare made the old system of denial seem almost quaint, but the legacy of those decades of careful denial remained significant. According to military historians and legal scholars examining the period, it had established a precedent that special forces operations existed in a different category than other military operations. They could be denied more easily. They required different levels of oversight. They operated under legal regimes that were less transparent. Even as the Cold War ended and democracies around the world began moving toward greater transparency in military operations, special forces remained compartmentalized and denied. The SAS itself, according to accounts from retired officers and regimental histories, accepted this as part of the bargain. The denial that had protected them operationally had also protected them institutionally. It had allowed them to develop doctrines and capabilities outside the glare of public scrutiny. It had given them freedom to experiment, to fail without public consequences, and to develop expertise that might have been constrained by more transparent oversight. The trade-off was that their personnel bore certain costs: the burden of operating under official denial, the lack of public acknowledgment of their service, the knowledge that if something went wrong, the government might not stand by them publicly. What the SAS's experience in plain clothes revealed, according to analysts of civil-military relations, was a fundamental tension at the heart of democratic governance. Democracies require transparency and accountability, but security and military operations sometimes require secrecy and discretion. Special forces, by their nature, operate at the extreme end of that spectrum. They are most effective when they are least visible. The question of how much invisibility a democracy can sustain, how much denial of military operations can exist before the system of accountability breaks down, is one that the British government wrestled with for decades. The parliamentary language remained remarkably consistent across decades of different governments and different global contexts. When asked about SAS deployments, ministers would confirm that the SAS had a role in national defense. They would confirm that personnel were trained for deployments. They would sometimes confirm that training operations or liaison activities were occurring. But they would not confirm active operations, not in detail, not in a way that allowed public understanding of what the unit was actually doing. According to analysts of parliamentary procedure who examined these exchanges over multiple decades, this represented a form of plausible deniability built into the fabric of official communications. The consistency of the approach across different time periods and different administrations suggested that this was not a matter of individual ministers being evasive or of political parties taking different approaches. Rather, it appeared to be an institutional commitment at the highest levels of the British state that certain operations would be maintained within a protective veil of denial. The fact that this system persisted despite changing governments, despite scandals, despite judicial inquiries that exposed the falsity of the denials, suggested that the British political and military establishment viewed the system of denial as fundamentally valuable to national security and to the conduct of special operations. The operators themselves, according to accounts from those who served, understood the game in all its dimensions. They knew that if they were compromised, if they were killed, if an operation went wrong, the denial would protect the government and leave them alone. The understanding was not implicit, it was made explicit in training and in the command structure's management of operations. Operators were told to understand that certain things they did would not be publicly acknowledged. If they were captured, they could not expect the government to negotiate for their release based on their military status, because the government would deny they were soldiers. If they were killed, their families might not receive full military honors until, years or decades later, the truth emerged. If an operation became controversial, the government's first response would be to deny involvement rather than to stand behind the operators. Some sources describe this as creating a certain detachment, an understanding that you were serving a system that would not openly acknowledge your service and therefore would not stand behind you in full public view. Other accounts suggest it created a stronger bond among operators, a sense that you were part of something elite precisely because it was denied to everyone else, because you were part of a community that understood things the public did not understand, because you were operating at the limits of what democracy officially acknowledged its military was doing. By the early 2020s, much of what the SAS had done in plain clothes had been disclosed through various official and unofficial channels. The broad strokes of their operations in Northern Ireland were documented in published histories. Their role in Iraq and Afghanistan had been acknowledged in detail, with declassified documents and video evidence making denial impossible. But the mechanisms that had allowed plainclothes denial in the past persisted and evolved. Modern special forces operations in Syria, against Islamic State, in the Sahel, and in other theaters continued to operate under rules that were less transparent than conventional military operations. According to current analyses of military transparency and special operations oversight, the precedents established during decades of denial in Northern Ireland and the Balkans had created a permanent category of operations that were treated differently from conventional military operations. The SAS's structure and institutional culture, refined over decades of operating in the gray zone, meant that special forces remained in a category apart, more secret, less accountable, more deniable than the rest of the armed forces. The government continued to resist transparency about special forces operations even after those operations had been publicly disclosed through other means. The lessons from the period of plainclothes denial had taught the state that it could maintain political distance from operations while still conducting those operations, and that it could control the public narrative through careful language and classification, even when the reality was known to journalists, researchers, and informed observers. The question of whether democracy could sustain itself with a permanently privileged class of military operations that existed outside normal accountability structures remained unresolved. The story of the SAS operating in plain clothes while Parliament was told nothing is, ultimately, a story about the limits of transparency in democratic governance and about the perverse incentives created when security classification systems intersect with democratic accountability. It is a story about how a nation can be technically truthful while being meaningfully dishonest, and about how this becomes possible when the people who are asked to hold the government accountable are themselves excluded from access to the facts. It is a story about how the pursuit of security and operational effectiveness can erode the mechanisms of democratic accountability, but also about how those mechanisms eventually reassert themselves when evidence accumulates beyond what denial can contain. And it is a story about men and women who operated in the gray zone, bearing a burden that their nation did not officially acknowledge they were bearing, the burden of conducting operations for the state while the state maintained it was not conducting those operations, of accepting risks in service to a nation that reserved the right to deny it had sent them, of maintaining silence about their service because the state required it, until history eventually made the denial unsustainable. The legacy of the SAS's plainclothes operations and the government's systematic denial of them has shaped how Britain's special forces continue to operate today and has set precedents for how democracies balance security and accountability that continue to be debated and contested decades later.